Hi guys, it's Miss Osborne coming to you from my couch with the first set of North Carolina final exam review videos. Today we're going to be looking at early America from 1492 to 1607. This includes the first start of America all the way leading up to the first set of colonies. Okay, so as you watch the video, make sure that you answer the guided questions that are provided. If you need to pause the video or rewatch the video in order to answer those guided questions, that's totally fine. Make sure that you are answering the questions fully and completely to the best of your knowledge. Okay, when the video ends, go ahead and summarize in paragraph form the main points of the video. I've given you some specific vocabulary on your WSQ sheet, and it's mainly using the bolded and underlined words from the video, so make sure you pay attention to those as we go through. And then I want you to finish by asking one question. And this question can either be something that you're still confused about, or something that you want to know more about, or something that you think would just make a good review question or a discussion question for the class. So the essential questions that we're going to be talking about in this video are: how did mercantilism encourage settlement of America, and how did religion affect the establishment of the colonies socially? So first off, mercantilism is the reason why the European powers came over to colonize America to begin with. Okay? European powers such as the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the British came to America looking for raw materials. Raw materials is pretty much anything that could make up a different product, but also they were looking for new markets in order to sell their goods, because as the colonies developed, they would have people there that would be a part of creating these colonies and would eventually buy these goods. So mercantilism is an economic policy that would establish a favorable balance of trade between a country and its colonies. And the whole goal of mercantilism is to increase the wealth of the home country. Okay? And the favorable balance of trade is in which the raw materials, the exports, are going to be greater than the imports, the finished goods. If you're exporting more, that means that you're selling more. If you're importing more, that means you're buying more, right? And you always want to sell more because you want to make more profit. So as explorers start to establish colonies in America, they realize that these colonies have access to raw materials and that those raw materials could eventually bring wealth to the home country. The main one that they're looking to transport is gold. Okay, the Columbian Exchange is established after Christopher Columbus and the Spanish established colonies mainly in the Bahamas and Cuba area. Okay. And he calls this area India because he believed that he had traveled to India. So the Columbian Exchange is the exchange of foods, plants, animals, and diseases between the Europeans and Native Americans. In the chart to the right, you can see that some of the goods that came to the Americas from Europe were things such as cows, horses, but also diseases like smallpox, the measles. Other things such as bananas and honeybees were also exchanged from the Europeans to the Americans, but then also some goods found their way from the Americas to Europe, like potatoes, peanuts, cocoa beans. Okay, Native Americans that were living in these colonies often suffered and died from diseases that were brought over from the Europeans. Okay, but there also were some diseases that were given to the Europeans from the Native Americans. Now, in order to make a profit, these colonies were founded by joint stock companies. And these joint stock companies were sending groups of people to the New World based on charters that they had gotten from the kings and queens of Europe. Okay, and they sent these groups of people to kind of get the raw materials and then send them back. Okay, one of the most famous joint stock companies is the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company is actually the company that settled Jamestown. Okay, and they first sent a group of 100 men to settle a company along the James River, and that is why it became known as Jamestown. However, Jamestown actually did not survive. Okay, so many men began to die due to the raids by Native Americans, but also diseases, and it isn't until John Rolfe is actually able to introduce tobacco in which the colony is able to survive. Okay, and the colony also brought over indentured servants. Okay, and these indentured servants agreed to work for 7 years in order for their passage to the New World to be paid off. Indentured servants play a really key role as a source of labor. However, as they start to expand the need for labor in the New World, they start to realize that they need to have a new system. Okay, and that's how we get to slavery. Okay, and those people who paid for the passage of a laborer, of an indentured servant, they often got a reward for bringing those indentured laborers to the New World. Okay, and this is under the head right system, and the head right system essentially said for each head or each person that you would bring to the New World, you would receive 50 acres of land. So if you brought over 3 servants, then you'd get 150 acres of land. This was especially beneficial to people who were rich, because the more people that they brought over, the more land they could potentially get. Okay, and slave labor is actually not introduced until the late 1600s, and it ends up spreading rapidly because you only have to make one purchase. Indentured servants, you had to pay for their passage, but then also they were free after 7 years, so you had to get a new indentured servant. Once you got a slave, you did not have to buy a new slave. Okay, and then also you could breed slaves too, and so this was an opportunity for those business leaders to end up making a lot of money off of the work of slaves from Africa. Okay, so the slaves actually carry passage through the Middle Passage, and that's the passage that is described to describe the travel from Africa to the New World. It was absolutely horrendous the way that slaves were treated. They were piled onto slave boats, often on top of each other and without proper food, and also the access to clean air, and they were completely treated irresponsibly. Okay, so the addition of slavery leads to the development of the triangular trade instead of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was particularly straight from the Europeans to America, but the triangular trade describes the triangle that was established from Europe to Africa and then to the Americas. And again, it's just the trading of those raw materials, but also slaves and the finished goods from the Americas to Europe. Former indentured servants ended up being very, very poor in the colonies. They lived mainly out in the West, farther away from the actual cities, because that was where land was cheaper, and they often suffered attacks by Native Americans. Okay, Native Americans lived farther out in the West because as more Europeans came into the colonies, they started pushing them farther and farther west. Nathaniel Bacon led an armed revolt to protest the treatment of indentured servants, mainly the attacks by Native Americans. Bacon's rebellion ends up exposing the tensions that had occurred between the rich and the poor. The planters had turned in slaves as more reliable sources of labor and kind of forgotten about indentured servants and the needs of those people out in the West. As slavery grows, so does tobacco farming, and eventually that will lead into cotton. Okay, but slavery is mainly established at first as tobacco because it required inexpensive labor. Okay, and slavery is legal in all of the 13 colonies at the beginning of the Revolution. Okay. The Stono Rebellion was one of the earliest acts of rebellion against slavery in America. In Charleston, South Carolina, these slaves attempted to flee to the south, to Spanish Florida. And if they had escaped to Spanish Florida, there wasn't as many colonies there besides St. Augustine, and so they had a good opportunity to escape and get their freedom for the Spanish. Another group of Americans who eventually become the establishment of America were called the Puritans, and the Puritans came to New England from Great Britain. They were seeking to escape religious persecution. They wanted religious freedoms, and they were led by John Winthrop. John Winthrop wanted to create a model Christian society, and the Puritans were mainly called the Puritans because they wanted to purify the English church, the Anglican church. They thought that the Anglican church had still become too Catholic, and so they sought to go to the New World because they were persecuted or discriminated against in Great Britain. And one of the most famous quotes of this is that for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of people are upon us. They wanted to be the model society in the New World. And so the Puritans immigrated to America for religious freedom, but they also weren't very accepting of other religions. Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams are some of the most famous rebels from the Puritan era because they challenged Puritan authorities. Anne Hutchinson mainly challenged gender roles, and Roger Williams didn't really appreciate how strict some of their policies were. Okay, so over time, the Puritans realized that they need to ease the certain requirements because they're not going to be able to expand their colony or let people come to their colony, right? Because people don't want to come to a place where they feel like they're discriminated against. So they established the halfway covenant, right? And the halfway covenant allowed for the baptism of children who had been baptized, but they were children of people who were baptized, but they were not converted to Puritanism. So it allowed them to become Puritan and be church members, even if they were like of another Protestant sect or Catholic. In 1692, young girls in the Salem village started acting really strange and accusing people of witchcraft. Witchcraft is pretty common in the 1600s due to the fact that people really thought that herbs were a way of life. Science hadn't really been quite as established yet. And the Salem witch trials really put the colony in a big turmoil, right? People were accusing other people. About 50 or some people were put on trial. Hundreds of people are arrested for being witches, and 19 are actually executed. They used really weird tactics to try to decide whether or not they were witches, such as like stoning them to death, burning them at a stake, hanging them. Some people were attached stones to their legs and then tried to drown them in the river, and if they drowned, they would be considered witches. All right, it was just completely ludicrous. Eventually, people get over the Salem witch trials, and the remaining prisoners are set free because they realize that the witches are not real and that the witch trials were kind of a hoax. Now, religion was a really, really big part of the first American colonies. The First Great Awakening was a real wave of religious revivals as people started turning away from the old lights, meaning that these old traditional values, and turning to new ministers that kind of led to the emotional appeal of religious practice, right? They started appealing on American people's feelings, and this created a lot of religious diversity among the colonies as new sects emerged. So don't forget to answer the guided questions. If you missed one of the questions, make sure that you watch the video again and pause where you need to. Once you feel like you have a pretty good understanding of the video, go ahead and summarize it in paragraph form, the main points, right? And I've given you the specific vocabulary on your WSQ. It's mainly the bolded and underlined words from the video. And then finish by asking one question, and this question can either be something that you're still confused about or that you think will be a good discussion question for the class. Thank you for joining me for this review video, and we'll see you for the next one.